The scarlet dust of Redemption Gulch clung to everything tasting of grit and regret. It settled in the lines of Finn Tolbett's face and coated the brim of his worn hat as he stepped into Miller's Mercantile. The air inside was thick with the smells of cured leather ground coffee and the cloying sweetness of horehound candy in a glass jar on the counter. It was a familiar scent, one that usually brought a sliver of comfort in a harsh land, but today comfort was in short supply. Three men, their postures reeking of borrowed authority, had old Mr. Miller cornered behind his own counter. They wore the brand of Thorne Shepherd's Ranch, not on their hides, but in the arrogant tilt of their heads and the casual way their hands rested near their sidearms. The biggest of them, a man with a face like a slab of sun-cured beef, jabbed a thick finger at a ledger on the counter. "The numbers don't lie, Miller." The man growled, his voice a low rumble. "Shepard's been generous extending your credit. But generosity has its limits." Mr. Miller, a man whose spine had been bent by 70 years of hard work and prairie winds, looked at the ledger with watery eyes. "It's been a dry season, Jed. The ranchers ain't buying supplies like they used to. I just need a little more time." "Time's a commodity Mr. Shepard ain't trading in today." Another of the men leaned and wheezily sneered. He began to idly pocket a handful of licorice sticks from a display. "Payments due, in cash or in kind." His eyes swept the sparsely stocked shelves, lingering on the few items of value. Finn had come to town for flour and salt, a simple trip to break the monotony of his solitary life on the small farm his parents had left him. He was a man of the earth, his hands calloused from the plow, his shoulders broad from hauling hay and mending fences. He preferred the quiet company of his livestock to the tangled affairs of men. But he'd known Mr. Miller since he was a boy, had been given a piece of horehound candy from that very jar every time his father brought him to town. He couldn't stand by and watch the old man be bullied into ruin. He moved forward, his worn boots making little sound on the dusty floorboards. "Leave him be," Finn said. His voice was quiet, not much more than a murmur, but it cut through the tense air like a sharpened blade. Jed turned a look of amused contempt on his face. "Well, now look what we got here. Finn Tolbett, the dirt farmer. Come to put in your 2 cents. The man asked for time." Finn set his gaze steady. He didn't look at Jed, but at the weaselly man who froze with his hand halfway to his mouth. "You ain't the law. You're just Shepard's dog sent to bark at his command." Jed's face darkened. He took a step toward Finn, his bulk casting a long shadow in the afternoon light pouring through the grimy front window. "You got a big mouth for a man with nothing to his name but a patch of worthless dirt." He shoved Finn hard in the chest. It was a powerful blow meant to send him staggering back to humiliate him. But Finn was rooted to the spot, solid as an old oak. He barely moved. He'd braced for it, his body honed by years of wrestling with stubborn soil and ornery livestock. The only thing that moved was a small silver locket that swung out from under his shirt on a worn leather cord. The weaselly man, seeing his chance, snatched at it. "What's this, some kind of fancy trinket?" The clasp was old and gave way easily. The locket sprang open, revealing 2 tiny faded photographs inside. On one side, a man and a woman, their faces etched with the same quiet strength Finn carried. On the other, a young girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. His parents, his sister Lily. The sight of their faces exposed in this grimy store under the cruel gaze of these men sent a shock of cold fury through Finn. A memory sharp and terrible flashed behind his eyes, the smell of smoke, the orange glow against a night sky, the terrible silence that followed. The fire had taken them all 15 years ago. The locket was all he had left. With a speed that belied his calm demeanor, Finn's hand shot out and clamped around the man's wrist. His grip was like iron. The man cried out, his fingers going limp, and the locket clattered to the floor. Finn didn't release him. He simply squeezed his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the man's face. "You don't touch that, Finn," said his voice now, a low, dangerous whisper. Jed moved to intervene, but a new voice stopped him. "That's enough." The voice belonged to Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary face told the story of a long and thankless career trying to keep the peace in a town owned in all but name by Thorne Shepherd. He stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his expression one of profound exhaustion. "Jed, you and your boys have made your point," the sheriff said. "Now get out of here before this gets any uglier." Jed glowered at Finn, then at the sheriff. He knew he couldn't win a fight against the law, not in public. With a final venomous glare, he motioned for his men. "This ain't over, Tolbert," he snarled before turning and stalking out of the store, his men trailing behind him like chastened curs. Finn released the man's wrist, and he scurried away, rubbing the bruised flesh. Finn knelt and picked up the locket, his fingers gently closing it over the faces of his family. The cold silver felt heavy in his palm, a constant reminder of all he had lost. "You all right, Finn?" Sheriff Brody asked, stepping inside. Finn nodded, tucking the locket back beneath his shirt. "I'm fine." Mr. Miller let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank you, son. They would have picked me clean." "Shepherd's getting bolder." Brody sighed, looking out the window after the departed men. "He thinks he owns this town and every soul in it." Before Finn could reply, the bell above the door chimed again. A man in a city suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine, stepped inside. He looked utterly out of place, a canary in a coop of dusty sparrows. He held a thick envelope in his hand. "Pardon me," the man said, his voice crisp and formal. "I'm looking for a Mr. Finn Tolbert." Finn turned, a sense of unease prickling his skin. "I'm Finn Tolbert." The man's face broke into a professional smile. "Excellent. My name is Wallace Rigsby. I'm an attorney. I've come from the territorial capital with some rather unexpected news for you. It concerns an inheritance from your late uncle, Mr. Jeremiah Tolbert." Finn stared at the lawyer, the name echoing strangely in his mind. Jeremiah Tolbert. A name he hadn't heard spoken in 15 years, not since the fire. He had no memory of an uncle. He'd been told his whole family had perished that night. The lawyer held out the envelope, and as Finn took it, he felt a sudden chilling premonition that the quiet, simple life he had known was about to be burned to the ground, just as his childhood home had been. The inheritance wasn't land or money. It was a key, and it was about to unlock a past he never knew existed. The ground beneath the cemetery was soft, too soft for a place where bodies had been buried for decades. Finn Tolbert pressed his boot into the earth near the rusted gate and watched it sink deeper than it should have. The deed Wallace Rigsby had given him felt heavier than the single page it was written on. Uncle Jeremiah, the ghost of a relative he never knew, had left him this place, this patch of forgotten graves on the sun-scorched outskirts of Redemption Gulch. And Finn couldn't understand why. A poor farmer inheriting a graveyard made about as much sense as rain falling upward. The lawyer's polished boots had looked absurd on Finn's weathered porch, just as this inheritance felt utterly alien in his life. He walked between the headstones, their granite surfaces pitted and worn by years of wind and dust. He counted them again. 7 graves. Only 7 for a cemetery supposedly in use for 30 years. The dates carved into the weathered stone markers told a story as strange as the inheritance itself. All the deaths had occurred within the same month decades ago. The burial plots were arranged in a perfect unnatural line, as if someone had planned exactly where each body would rest. That wasn't how grief worked. Grief was messy, chaotic. This was orderly, deliberate. The morning sun, a merciless white eye in the vast blue sky, cast long shadows that stretched like accusing fingers across the uneven ground. It was then Finn noticed something else, something that made the hair on his arms stand up. Near the far corner of the property, where a gnarled oak tree stood a lonely vigil over the fence line, the earth showed signs of recent disturbance. Not fresh enough to be a new grave, but recent enough to be jarringly out of place. Someone had been digging here. He knelt the rough fabric of his trousers, scratching against his knees, and ran his fingers through the dirt. It was loose, mixed with a reddish clay that didn't match the pale sandy soil of the surrounding ground. Finn had worked the land his entire life. He knew its textures, its secrets. This earth was foreign. Someone had moved this soil and replaced it, trying to make it look undisturbed, but failing to match the natural settling that only time could accomplish. Standing, he brushed the dust from his hands and looked back toward the distant silhouette of Redemption Gulch. The weather-beaten storefronts, with false fronts peeling like sunburnt skin, seemed to shimmer in the heat haze. If Uncle Jeremiah had wanted him to have this place, there had to be a reason beyond some forgotten family obligation. The old man could have left it to the church, sold it for a pittance, or let the town claim it for unpaid taxes. Instead, he had specifically named Finn Tolbert in his will. A will delivered by a city lawyer who seemed to know more than he was letting on. Rigsby's questions had been too casual, his interest in Finn's plans for the property too keen. An unusual inheritance, to be sure. The lawyer had mused, tapping a manicured finger on his leather briefcase. But some land holds more than just memories, Mr. Tolbert. Sometimes it holds value you can't see from the surface. The wind picked up a hot, dry breath that rustled the few brittle wildflowers growing between the graves. Finn pulled the deed from his shirt pocket, the paper already warm from his body heat. He studied the boundaries described in the dense legal language. The cemetery was larger than it appeared, extending well beyond the visible fence line. According to the document, his inheritance included not just the burial ground, but several acres of what looked like empty prairie, stretching toward the jagged purple peaks of the mountains. But empty prairie wasn't valuable enough to warrant the strange look in Rigsby's eyes, nor the sudden unwelcome attention it was about to bring. A plume of dust on the horizon caught his eye. A rider moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned every piece of land his horse touched. Even from this distance, Finn recognized the silhouette. Thorne Shepard. The largest landowner in 3 counties, a man who collected property the way other men collected stamps, was riding directly toward the cemetery. That was when the first piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just a forgotten boneyard. This was something Shepard wanted. And Finn realized with a sinking feeling that his inheritance might be worth far more trouble than money. Thorne Shepard dismounted with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle. His black stallion, a magnificent animal with a coat like polished obsidian, snorted and pawed at the alkali flats, its dark eyes mirroring the intensity of its owner. Shepard himself was an imposing figure, dressed in a tailored black coat that defied the blistering heat. His face was clean-shaven, his silvering hair meticulously combed, but his eyes, pale cold and calculating, assessed everything they saw for its worth, its weakness, its price. Mr. Tolbert Shepard's voice was smooth-cultured, a stark contrast to the rough tones of his hired men. It carried the easy authority of someone who had never been told no. "I heard you came into some property." Finn kept his expression neutral, a mask of sun-weathered impassivity he had perfected over the years. News travels fast. "It does when it concerns land that borders mine," Shepard replied, gesturing with a gloved hand toward the mountains. He began to walk the perimeter of the low rusted fence, his expensive boots crunching on the dry earth. Your uncle and I had an understanding about this place. A gentleman's agreement. He was planning to sell to me before his unfortunate passing. It was a lie. Finn felt it in the subtle tightening of Shepard's jaw, the slight hesitation before the word unfortunate. If Jeremiah had been planning to sell Wallace, Rigsby would have mentioned it. Instead, the lawyer had seemed genuinely surprised by the will, as if the old man had kept his final intentions a secret from everyone. "What kind of understanding?" Finn asked, his voice flat. Shepard stopped his pacing and walked closer, his boots clicking against the small stones scattered among the graves. Jeremiah was a practical man. He knew this land wasn't suitable for farming. Too rocky, too isolated. He paused beside one of the 7 headstones, tracing the carved date with the tip of his finger. The gesture was oddly intimate, too familiar for a man discussing a mere business transaction. But it has other uses. Practical uses for a man with the right vision. I offered him fair market value, more than fair considering. Finn watched him, his senses on high alert. Shepard was studying the graves with an unnerving intensity, his gaze lingering on the names, the dates, the precise spacing between them. He wasn't looking at a cemetery. He was surveying a chessboard, and Finn was the unexpected, unwelcome new piece. "The property isn't for sale," Finn stated plainly. It was a reflex, an instinct. He didn't know what this land held, but if Shepard wanted it this badly, it was worth holding on to. A thin, predatory smile touched Shepard's lips. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Talbot. It is simply a matter of finding the right price." He turned away from the headstone and fixed his cold gaze on Finn. "A man's legacy is built on the ground he stands on. I'd hate to see yours be a plot of dirt and sorrow. A man like yourself could use the money. I'm prepared to offer you 3 times what this land is assessed for. A generous offer for a place that brings in nothing but weeds." That was the second lie, bigger and more revealing than the first. Men like Thorne Shepard didn't become wealthy by overpaying for worthless land. His generosity was a weapon, his offers a trap. Whatever made this property valuable, it was buried deeper than the 7 bodies resting beneath their feet. "I'll need time to consider any offer," Finn replied, buying himself a moment to think. Of course, Shepard's smile was practiced and empty. "But don't take too long. Opportunities like men have a way of expiring when circumstances change." The threat was as clear as the blue sky above them, a velvet glove wrapped around an iron fist. Finn had heard the stories whispered in the saloon tales of ranchers who refused Shepard's reasonable offers only to find their wells mysteriously running dry or their fences cut, their cattle scattered to the winds. The law embodied by the weary Sheriff Brody was little match for a man with Shepard's money and influence. As Shepard mounted his horse, he paused, his gaze sweeping over the cemetery one last time. It lingered for a fraction of a second on the patch of disturbed soil near the oak tree. A flicker of something, calculation, perhaps even concern, crossed his features before the mask of confident authority settled back into place. He wheeled the black stallion around and rode away, leaving Finn alone in the oppressive silence. Finn waited until the rider was a mere speck on the horizon before he walked back to the loose earth. The encounter had sharpened his resolve. This was no longer just about a strange inheritance. It was about the truth. Kneeling, he began to dig, not with a shovel, but with his bare hands, working slowly and methodically. The foreign clay was packed tightly, a deliberate seal. He scraped away rocks and hardened clumps of dirt, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft. 2 feet down, they struck something hard and flat. Not stone, not bone. It was the unyielding edge of something man-made, buried with purpose. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He worked faster, clearing the dirt away to reveal the corner of an oiled leather pouch wrapped carefully to protect its contents from moisture and time. Uncle Jeremiah hadn't just left him a cemetery. He had left him a map a secret. And judging by Thorn Shepherd's behavior, it was a secret powerful men were willing to kill to keep buried. As he worked to free the package from its earthen hiding place, he heard the distant drumming of hoofbeats on the hard-packed earth. Multiple riders moving fast. Someone had been watching, waiting. Finn clutched the heavy leather pouch against his chest and scrambled behind the thick trunk of the gnarled oak, its rough bark pressing into his back. The sound of the horses grew louder, at least 3 riders, their pace steady and purposeful. They weren't passing by. They were coming here. His fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, worked at the stiff leather ties binding the pouch. He had to know. He had to see what secret Jeremiah had deemed important enough to bury in a lonely graveyard. The leather was old, but supple, treated with oils that had kept it from rotting. As the ties came loose, he could hear voices carried on the wind, low, serious tones discussing property lines, deeds, and legal challenges. Inside the pouch, wrapped in a final layer of oiled cloth, was a collection of papers. Even in the dappled shade of the oak, he could see they were official documents, stamped with the formal seals of the territorial government. There were land deeds, survey maps, and what appeared to be mineral rights certificates. The dates stretched back 40 years long before Jeremiah had supposedly acquired this small plot. The first deed made Finn's breath catch in his throat. It wasn't for the cemetery alone. It was for a massive tract of land, a kingdom of prairie and foothills stretching from the mountains to the river valley. It included almost all of what was now Thorn Shepherd's sprawling ranch. And the original owner listed on the deed, dated 50 years prior, was not Jeremiah, but his own father, Elias Tolbert. The second document was a geological survey map, meticulously hand-drawn. It showed vast deposits of iron ore and coal seams running like dark veins deep beneath the surface of the land that now belonged to Shepherd. The highest concentrations were marked directly underneath Shepherd's most profitable grazing pastures. Scrawled notes in the margin, in a tidy script he vaguely recognized as his uncle's, indicated the survey had been commissioned in secret just 6 months ago. The voices were closer now, sharp and clear. Someone was explaining the legal complexities of inherited property. Another voice, younger and more nervous, asked what would happen if the original deeds were ever discovered. Finn's blood ran cold. He quickly rewrapped the documents and shoved them back into the pouch. This was more than an inheritance. It was a reclamation. It was proof that his family, the Tolberts, were the rightful owners of the land and wealth that had made Thorn Shepherd a king. No wonder Shepherd was so eager to buy this small cemetery. It was the one piece of the puzzle he didn't own, the loose thread that could unravel his entire empire. The riders crested the small hill that separated the cemetery from the main road. The man in the lead was Sheriff Brody. Behind him rode 2 men in city clothes, their clean suits and stiff postures marking them as outsiders, lawyers, or government officials from the territorial capital. Finn pressed himself deeper into the shadow of the oak as the men dismounted. Brody gestured toward the headstones, speaking to his companions. The deceased owner, Jeremiah Tolbert, left specific instructions, the sheriff was saying. But any claims regarding the inheritance must be verified through the Territorial Land Office before they can be considered legitimate. Finn understood instantly. This wasn't a coincidence. Shepherd hadn't just threatened him. He had acted. He had summoned the law, hoping to challenge the will's legitimacy before Finn could even begin to understand what he possessed. Sheriff Brody began walking among the headstones, his boot heels crunching on the gravel. His gaze was sharp, methodical. He was conducting an official investigation. His boot came down inches from the edge of the freshly disturbed earth. He stopped. He knelt, studying the loose soil with the practiced eye of a man trained to notice details others missed. "Someone's been here recently," Brody announced, his voice carrying in the still air. "This ground has been dug up within the last few hours." Finn held his breath, the leather pouch feeling as heavy as a cannonball against his chest. One of the city men approached. Could be animals. Coyotes. "This isn't animal digging." Brody cut him off. Too neat. Too purposeful. Someone was looking for something. Finn's mind raced. He was trapped. If he stayed hidden, they would find the hole and know someone had removed whatever was buried there. If he tried to run, they'd see him. His only option was to face them, but what could he say? He was trespassing on land, whose ownership was now officially in dispute, and he had just removed a hidden cache of documents. In their eyes, he was a thief. The second city man, holding a survey map of his own, began walking directly toward the oak tree, intent on examining the property boundaries. In seconds, he would be upon him. Taking a deep breath, Finn stood up and stepped out from behind the trunk, forcing himself to appear calm. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice even, "is there something I can help you with?" Brody's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol before he recognized Finn. "Tolbert. We weren't expecting to find you here." "It's my property." Finn replied, the words feeling hollow even as he said them. "I have a right to be here." "That's actually what we need to discuss," said the first city man, stepping forward. He was tall and severe, with eyes that seemed to look right through him. "I'm Samuel Morrison from the Territorial Land Office. We've received a formal challenge to your inheritance." Morrison opened a leather satchel and withdrew a thick bundle of papers tied with a red ribbon. "According to our records, this property was sold 3 years ago to pay outstanding debts. The current legal owner of record is the Shepherd Land Company." The ground seemed to tilt beneath Finn's feet. If Shepherd legally owned the cemetery, then Jeremiah's will was meaningless. He wasn't an heir. He was a trespasser. A trespasser who had just stolen a pouch of documents from Thorn Shepherd's land. The silence that followed Samuel Morrison's declaration was as heavy and suffocating as a shroud. Sheriff Brody's face was a mask of weary resignation. He'd seen Shepherd's legal machinations play out a dozen times before. Morrison, the man from the land office, watched Finn with an impassive, bureaucratic stare. "There must be some mistake," Finn said, his voice raspy. The pouch beneath his shirt felt like it was burning a hole through his skin. "No mistake, Mr. Tolbert Morrison," replied, his tone crisp. "We have the bill of sale properly notarized and filed. Your uncle may have believed he still owned this land, but legal ownership transferred to Mr. Shepherd's company when the debts went unpaid." Sheriff Brody shifted his weight, his gaze locking onto Finn. It wasn't an unkind look, but it was probing, official. "Finn, did you remove anything from this property today? Any documents, personal effects? Given the dispute, anything you found could be crucial." The question hung in the air, a hangman's noose. Finn's mind spun. The pouch against his chest held the truth proof of his family's original ownership, his uncle's secret survey. But revealing it now would be an admission of guilt. He had dug on land that, according to these men, belonged to Thorn Shepherd. They would seize the documents, declare them forgeries, and charge him with theft. Before he could answer, another rider appeared on the horizon, the same imposing silhouette as before. Thorn Shepherd was returning not to negotiate, but to oversee the final checkmate in a game he had been playing for years. He was riding back to personally witness the law-stripped Finn of his inheritance and brand him a criminal. Shepherd dismounted and approached the group, his lips curled in a triumphant smirk. His eyes darted from the disturbed soil to Finn's tense posture, and he knew. He knew Finn had found it. "Gentlemen, I'm glad you could respond so quickly." Shepherd said, his voice dripping with false sincerity, as he addressed the officials, though his venomous gaze remained fixed on Finn. As I explained in my letter, there are serious questions about the legitimacy of this so-called inheritance. Morrison nodded grimly. Mr. Shepard, you claim that while Jeremiah Tolbert retained surface ownership, you purchased all subsurface mineral rights to this property 3 years ago. Do you have documentation? Shepard reached into his coat and produced a leather folder. The original contract, signed by Jeremiah Tolbert himself and witnessed by my attorney. He handed the papers to Morrison. They looked official, but Finn saw Shepard's fingers drumming a nervous rhythm against his thigh as Morrison examined them. It was a small crack in his confident facade. These documents appear to be in order, Morrison said after a moment. However, he added, frowning, they were never filed with the Territorial Land Office as required by law. Without proper registration, their legal validity is questionable. A simple oversight by my attorney Shepard replied smoothly. The contract itself is legitimate. Jeremiah received full payment. Sheriff Brody stepped closer to Finn, his voice low but firm. Finn, you still haven't answered my question. Finn felt the weight of 15 years of solitude, of loss, of silent grief. He thought of the locket, of the faces of the family he barely remembered, and of the father who had apparently once owned this entire valley. This was more than land. It was his history. I found something, Finn said, his voice clear and steady. The lie was too heavy a burden to carry. But I want your word that what I show you will be examined fairly without any preconceived notions. Shepard's face contorted in a flash of rage. Anything found on this property belongs to me. If documents were buried here, they were placed on my land without permission and are forfeit. That's exactly the kind of preconceived notion I'm talking about. Finn shot back, his own anger rising. These documents were buried by my uncle on land he believed he owned. And if they prove his claim, then your contract might be the fraudulent one. Enough, Morrison held up a hand. Mr. Tolbert, produce what you found. Sheriff Brody will ensure all parties are treated fairly. With slow, deliberate movements, Finn withdrew the leather pouch. As he untied the strings, he saw Shepard's face go pale beneath its tan. Shepard knew what was inside, or at least he feared it. The truth was about to be unearthed, for better or for worse. But as Finn opened the pouch, the sound of more approaching horses echoed across the cemetery. This time, the riders were moving at a gallop. Another player was entering the game just as the final hands were being dealt. The lead rider was Wallace Rigsby, the city lawyer, his face flushed and his fine suit covered in a layer of dust. Behind him rode two grim-faced men, whose formal attire couldn't conceal the hard set of their jaws or the professional way their eyes scanned the scene. Sheriff Brody Rigsby called out, swinging down from his horse before it had even stopped. I apologize for the interruption, but I have urgent information that cannot wait. He strode toward the group, his companions dismounting and positioning themselves like silent, observant sentinels. What is it? Rigsby Morrison asked, his hand hovering over the documents Finn was about to reveal. 3 hours ago, Rigsby announced, his voice ringing with authority. I received a telegram from the territorial capital. The mineral rights contract Mr. Shepard purports to have with Jeremiah Tolbert has been under investigation for suspected fraud by the Attorney General's office for the last month. Shepard went completely white. That's impossible. The contract is legitimate. The signature on your contract has been compared to authenticated samples of Jeremiah Tolbert's handwriting. Rigsby continued his words like hammer blows. The territorial handwriting expert has concluded that the signature is a forgery. Furthermore, the witness you listed, your attorney Marcus Whitfield, passed away 2 weeks before. The contract was allegedly signed. The revelation stunned the group into silence. Morrison snatched Shepard's contract and began examining it with new suspicious eyes. Sheriff Brody moved to Shepard's side, his hand now resting firmly on the butt of his pistol. Shepard's composure finally shattered. "You don't understand. Jeremiah owed me money, a lot of money. The forged signature was his idea, a way to settle the debt without his family knowing. Participating in document forgery is a serious crime, regardless of who suggested it," Morrison stated coldly. Finn seized the moment. He laid the contents of the pouch on a flat headstone for all to see, the old deed in his father's name and the recent geological survey. According to this, Finn set his finger tracing the lines on the map. "My uncle commissioned this survey 6 months ago, long after Mr. Shepard claims to have purchased the mineral rights. This isn't the work of a man selling his land. It's the work of a man trying to discover its true value." Rigsby nodded, pulling another document from his saddlebags. The telegram also included instructions from the Attorney General. "Mr. Tolbert, your inheritance is legally valid and includes full ownership of all surface and subsurface mineral rights. Mr. Shepard's claims are fraudulent." The victory was sudden, absolute. But just as relief began to wash over Finn, he saw a change come over Shepard. The fear and panic in his eyes were replaced by something else, something cold and dark. He lifted his gaze from the damning evidence on the headstone and looked past Finn toward the vast, empty prairie. A strange, mournful expression crossed his face. "This was never about the money," Shepard said, his voice barely a whisper. He turned to face Finn, his eyes burning with an intensity that was terrifying. "You think this is about coal, about iron ore, you fool. This is about justice. This is about blood." Finn stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" Shepard took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous hiss. "My family is buried here, Tolbert, in this very cemetery. My wife Eleanor, my son Thomas, in unmarked graves right over there." He pointed a trembling finger toward a barren patch of ground near the fence. "They're not on any of your maps, are they? Because they were murdered. Murdered by a corrupt posse led by a man who wanted my land, my water rights. A man named Elias Tolbert. Your father." The world tilted on its axis. Finn felt the blood drain from his face. His father, a murderer, it was impossible. Elias Tolbert had been a good man, a quiet farmer. The fire that killed your family 15 years ago. Shepard's lips twisted into a grotesque smile of triumph. "That wasn't an accident. That was my justice, my revenge. I took from him what he took from me. And I want this land not for the minerals beneath it, but to build a monument to my family on the graves of my enemies. I want to own the very ground your bloodline is buried in." The confession, raw and shocking, hung in the silent air. The legal dispute over deeds and mineral rights had evaporated, replaced by a terrible personal vendetta that spanned decades. Finn looked from the pouch of documents, the proof of his wealth, to the locket that still hung beneath his shirt, the proof of his loss. He was not the heir to a fortune. He was the heir to a blood feud he never knew existed. And the man who had orphaned him was standing right in front of him, stripped of everything but his hatred. Suddenly, one of Shepard's men, the one named Jed, whom Finn had faced in the store, let out a choked sob. All eyes turned to him. His face was ashen, his big body trembling. "It ain't true, boss," Jed stammered, looking at Shepard with pleading eyes. "It wasn't like that. You know it wasn't." Shepard's head snapped toward him. "Silence, you fool." But Jed couldn't stop. The guilt held in for years was pouring out of him. It wasn't no posse, he cried, his words tumbling over each other. "I was there. It was the flash flood down by Cutter's Creek. Their wagon, it got swept away. We tried to save them, boss, we really did. It was an accident. A terrible, terrible accident. Shepard stared at his man, his face a canvas of disbelief, and then rage, then utter collapse. The lie he had built his entire life upon, the vengeful purpose that had driven him for 2 decades, had just been demolished by the one man who knew the truth. He was not a righteous avenger. He was just a man who had twisted a tragedy into an excuse for murder. His eyes, now completely unhinged, darted around looking for an escape, for a weapon, for anything to reclaim his shattered reality. His gaze landed on Wallace Rigsby. In a single desperate movement, Shepard lunged, pulling a concealed derringer from his boot and pressing it to the lawyer's temple. "Nobody moves." Shepard screamed, his voice cracking. Rain began to fall, fat, heavy drops that splattered in the dust as if the sky itself were weeping. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the mountains. The final confrontation had begun. The storm broke with a fury that seemed torn from Shepard's own soul. A jagged fork of lightning split the darkening sky, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder that rattled the very headstones. The sudden downpour drenched them all in seconds, turning the dust to a thick, clinging mud. "Back away, all of you," Shepard shrieked, dragging the terrified Wallace Rigsby backward. The tiny derringer looked like a toy in his hand, but it was pressed firmly against the lawyer's skull, and everyone knew it was deadly. Sheriff Brody had his pistol drawn, but he couldn't get a clear shot. Shepard let him go. "It's over." "It's not over until I say it is." Shepard's eyes were wild, darting between Finn and the broken confession of his own man, Jed. The foundation of his life, a carefully constructed narrative of righteous vengeance, had crumbled to dust, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of his crimes. He was no longer a wronged husband and father, but a murderer and a liar. "You've been lying to us all these years?" one of the other ranch hands asked, his voice full of disbelief and horror. "You had us believing? You made us hate them for nothing." Shepard ignored him, his entire focus converging on Finn. "You!" He spat the rain, plastering his silver hair to his forehead. "This is your fault. Your family's curse." Finn stood his ground, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He felt a strange calm settle over him. The revelation of his father's innocence was a profound relief, but it was overshadowed by the tragic, pointless waste of it all. This entire cycle of hatred was built on a lie. "My father didn't kill your family," Shepard, Finn said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind and rain. "He wasn't a murderer. And you're not an avenger. You're just a man who couldn't face the truth." "The truth?" Shepard laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "The truth is that my wife and son are dead, and your family is dead. That's the only truth that matters." The standoff was a stalemate. The territorial marshals accompanying Rigsby had their weapons drawn, creating a semicircle of armed lawmen, but Shepard's hold on his hostage was too secure. The scene was chaotic, a tableau of mud rain and desperation. Finn thought of the journal entries he'd found tucked away in the pouch, with the deed's frantic scribbles from his uncle Jeremiah in the last weeks of his life. "Shepard knows I'm looking into the past." One entry read, "He visits the graves, not ours, the empty ground. He talks to them. He is a man haunted by ghosts of his own making." Jeremiah had suspected the truth, had been piecing it together. He hadn't just left Finn a fortune. He had left him the key to ending a war. "Let the lawyer go," Shepard, Finn said, taking a slow step forward. "This is between you and me. It always has been." "Stay back," Shepard screamed, jamming the pistol harder against Rigsby's head. But Finn kept walking, his movements slow, deliberate. "You built a monument of hate on a foundation of lies. Look at you. You've lost everything. Your land, your men, your reason for living. What's left?" Every word was a chisel chipping away at the last remnants of Shepard's sanity. He saw the flicker of doubt in Shepard's eyes, the tremor in his hand. He was losing control. In that moment of hesitation, Sheriff Brody saw his opening. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to one of the marshals positioned to Shepard's side. It was all the signal needed. The marshal lunged not at Shepard, but low-tackling Rigsby and pulling him out of the line of fire. The move was so swift, so unexpected, that Shepard was left standing alone, his weapon pointed at empty air. For a heartbeat he froze. Then with a roar of pure animal rage, he turned the Derringer on Finn. Finn didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon he didn't have. He simply stood there, his gaze locked on the man who had destroyed his life. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from the Derringer. It was the louder, deeper crack of Sheriff Brody's revolver. Shepard cried out, stumbling backward, his hand flying to his shoulder, where a patch of dark red was already blossoming on his soaked coat. The Derringer fell from his numb fingers, disappearing into the mud. He staggered, clutching his wound, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. He looked at Finn, at the lawmen closing in at the gray, weeping sky. The fight was gone, leaving only a hollow, broken shell of a man. He sank to his knees in the mud, the reign of Thorn Shepard ending not with a bang, but with a pathetic, defeated whimper. The lawmen were on him in an instant, hauling him to his feet, binding his hands. He didn't resist. The lie was dead, and with it the man he had pretended to be for 20 years. Wallace Rigsby, shaken but unharmed, was helped to his feet. He looked at Finn with a newfound respect. That was incredibly foolish and incredibly brave, Mr. Tolbert. Finn barely heard him. He walked over to the spot where Shepard had fallen and picked up the small, mud-caked Derringer. It felt pathetic in his hand, a symbol of a pointless, devastating feud. He looked over at Shepard, a broken figure being led away by the marshals, stripped of his power, his land, and his vengeful purpose. Finn could have felt triumph or hatred or satisfaction. Instead, all he felt was a profound and aching sorrow for all the lives that had been destroyed by one man's refusal to accept a tragedy he could not control. The rain began to soften, the thunder retreating into the mountains. A sliver of pale sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the drenched cemetery. Finn looked at the 7 weathered headstones of his own family, then at the empty patch of ground where Shepard's wife and son had been lost to a raging creek so many years ago. The war was over. Now the long, difficult work of making peace could begin. In the months that followed, Redemption, Gulch began to breathe again. The oppressive shadow of Thorn Shepard had lifted, and in its place, Finn Tolbert quietly began to sow seeds of renewal. The immense wealth that flowed from the coal and iron deposits beneath his land was not hoarded or spent on personal luxury. It was reinvested into the town he now called home. He started by paying off Mr. Miller's debts, ensuring the mercantile shelves were full again. He provided low-interest loans to the ranchers and farmers Shepard had squeezed, allowing them to buy new stock and repair their properties. A new schoolhouse was built, its bright pine walls a symbol of a future that had until recently seemed impossible. Finn never sought recognition or power. His actions were his only statements. He was no longer just a farmer. He had become the town's silent guardian. His own life changed as well. He bought a modest ranch adjacent to his holdings, but he kept his parents' old farmhouse, repairing its fire-scarred timbers and tending the small plot of land where he had grown up. He was a wealthy man, but he never forgot the feel of soil on his hands. One crisp autumn afternoon, he returned to the cemetery. The air was clean, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. He was not alone. A stonemason was with him, carefully unloading 2 new headstones from a wagon. They were simple, elegant slabs of gray granite, devoid of ostentatious carving. Finn directed the mason to the barren patch of earth near the fence line, the spot Shepard had pointed to in his final desperate moments. Under Finn's guidance, the two headstones were set firmly in the earth. The first read, Eleanor Shepard, beloved wife. The second, Thomas Shepard, beloved son. There were no dates, only the simple acknowledgement of their existence, a final quiet testament to a tragedy that had spawned so much pain. It was an act of forgiveness, a closing of the circle. By honoring their memory, he was breaking the cycle of revenge for good. As the mason packed his tools, Finn walked over to his own family's graves. He had cleaned the old stones, and the names of his parents and his sister Lily were now clear and sharp in the afternoon light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. It was his uncle's. Tucked into the final pages, he had found a folded, yellowed letter. It was from his father Elias, written to Jeremiah just weeks before the fire. He had read it 100 times, but he needed to read it again, here in this place. Dear brother. The letter began. There was a terrible accident down by Cutter's Creek. A flash flood. A family in a wagon was swept away. A man named Shepard new to the territory. His wife and boy. We couldn't get to them in time. I have never felt so helpless, Jeremiah. The man is broken by grief, and in his pain, he looks for someone to blame. He looks at me, at the other ranchers who were there. I fear this tragedy will cast a long shadow. I pray that God grants him peace, but I see a darkness in his eyes that worries me. Be well, my brother. Elias. Finn folded the letter and placed it back in the journal. Here was the final piece of the puzzle, the complete, unvarnished truth. His father wasn't a murderer. He was a witness to a tragedy, a good man who had feared the very darkness that had ultimately consumed both their families. He pulled the silver locket from beneath his shirt and opened it, looking at the faded photographs of the people he had lost. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't feel the sharp sting of grief or the dull ache of loneliness. He felt peace. He felt closure. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest, not just in the soft earth beneath his feet, but in his own heart. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A new legacy had been forged here, not one of blood and vengeance, but of forgiveness, community, and hope. Finn mounted his horse, gave one last look at the quiet cemetery, and rode toward home, a changed man, finally free.